one of them that we're lucky to have. His most recent translated novel is this one here, Black Flower, which was out just a few, about 5-6 months ago. So I want to start with a very basic question, as some of us might know and others might not, how you came to be a writer. I became especially curious about this after I heard your TED Talk, an excellent TED Talk called Be an Artist Now.
So when I was young, I lived in near the DMZ area, because my father was an army officer. And my parents wanted me to be a kind of businessman or accountant, so who is able to make big money and a stable job. So I entered into the Yonsei University, and my major is the business administration. In Korea, we call this kind of act hyodo. I wanted to be a good son to my parents, but that is my last good act to my parents. So I didn't study at all. And business administration and then the subjects of that major were really boring, and so I need some kind of exit in this case. So I wrote some the short fiction on the net. So I found some audience. They said to me, so they liked my stories, so they encouraged me. So why don't you write some longer things? So so I just began to write and began to study, began to read serious fictions and good pieces of fictions. So that is my beginning.
It's a very interesting TED Talk, if you haven't heard that, quite inspiring. Young-ha was just telling me in the back that after this talk was put up, he's been getting lots of mail from both people in Korea as well as all around the world saying, I've started painting again after stopping for decades, or I've started to write. I think that's very exciting when you can start momentum for someone else that way. Black Flower strikes me as a radical departure from anything you've written before in its narrative telling, and especially the montage of characters, and also the pacing as well. I was wondering, how did you come to this idea, and what did this novel mean to you personally?
Black Flower is my third novel, and before this novel, I didn't write historical fiction. So back then, my audience told me, "Oh, we didn't expect you write this historical fiction." So there was a friend of mine. He's the film director, and he flew to Seoul from Los Angeles, and on the flight, he met the scholar next to sit to him. So the scholar told him a very interesting, intriguing story. So he was studying the Korean immigration history. So he told to my friend. So enjoy it. So in 1905, so 1,000 and more the Korean people moved to Mexico, and they worked at the haciendas, the plantations, Anakin plantation in the Yucatan Peninsula, but they were not able to return to Korea because Korea was occupied by Japan, and the nation was disappeared. So, and 1910, the Mexican Revolution began. So in that chaos, some of them moved to the northern Guatemala, and they built a small nation in the jungle. So New Korea, kind of New Korea. So that is very so fantastic stories. So but he didn't buy that stone because it sounded too fantastic, too too great. So but I did some research in the library, so I found some clues. So that story could be the true story. So I flew to Mexico and Yucatan Peninsula and Guatemala, and I began to write the first chapter of the Black Flower in Antigua in Guatemala. So
it's funny. I do recall one of the questions that I had wanted to ask was about this itinerant lifestyle of yours. I met Young-ha last year when my book came out at a reading in New York City, and we had a meal together, and I could never forget what he had said to me at that time. He looked at me and he said, "You're now a writer, but a professional writer, you will be lonely." And I thought, oh gosh, it's been 2 weeks into I started, I learned I'll be lonely for the rest of my life. What does this mean? And I learned in the last year and a half what that, in some ways, that means or that entails as you're traveling all around the world or jumping around, and I've spent very little time in Seoul for that reason. And I wonder, what is that like for you? Because you spent so much of your time overseas, and even when you're here, you're on the move all the time. How has that both changed your work and your life? Loneliness, because I see that in your work. Solitude is a preoccupation.
Yes, I remember the face of Krys when I told the secret to Krys, you will be lonely, and so yes, as I wanted to cheer her off, but but I believe yes, being a writer the means become lonely guy, lonely person. So so I live in the Busan now. So there is no friends in Busan. So nobody makes a phone call to me. So but I accept. Yeah, I accept.
Not only accept, in some ways you've created it by voluntarily moving to Busan. I think you've talked about this before too, and I found that really interesting.
Yes, I hate people. Yes, but the writer, the job of the writer, a writer is making a world. So for his or her own the world. So I believe the writer should live with them, so my characters and in my world. So sometimes I have some trouble, so living with people and hanging out with people. So I tell them I charge myself with kind of battery. So socialistic battery. Batteries, but it doesn't last 2 hours or 3 hours. So and then I had to go back to my walk, go back to my world, go back to my characters, go back to my novels. So now you see my very socialistic ego, and or as avatar of Kim Young. The real Kim Young is walking on his desk. So this is my avatar, and very look friendly and smiling. This is not me.
Very suspect. Actually, speaking of characters, when you speak of avatar or mask, the first story I read of yours was 너의 의미, which was anthologized and it won the 이상 문학상, the 이상 Literary Prize, I think in 2003.
Yes.
And I was intrigued because the main character is a sleazy playboy film director, quite comical character as well. And the first character, the main character in I Have the Right to Destroy Myself, 나를 파괴할 권리가 있다, is in some ways, not very a suspect as well. But then there's this other great tonal range and personalities and backgrounds that have emerged in the next 10 years of your work. That's kind of an astonishing range. But I'm wondering, you as a writer, there's something secret there that's tying all these characters together, or there's reasons why certain characters are more interesting and you become obsessed and you want to live with certain characters longer than others. And what, tell us something about that. What attracts you to, these particular characters?
So I believe everyone is special. So everyone is weird. So everyone has some weird aspect in their mind, so their acts. So I just watch them. So in 2003, from 2001 to 2004, I worked with the film industry. I wrote some film scripts and I worked with them. So I watched them and I don't know. So I don't know. How can I say? Yes, people says that in your novels and in your short stories there are many characters and so big spectrums of the characters. So I don't know how I pick the characters. They just come to me. So yeah, but I really like to watch people and to talk to them. So let me tell a story. So 10 years ago, 9 years ago, the computer, the desktop computer was broken. So a computer guy visited my house, and he and I were talking about his life and his wife and his sons, and so he wanted to return his the office. So he told his boss the lie. So this desktop computer was totally broken. So I needed more time. So he and I just were talking everything of his life and how he became how can I say a repairman, and so how much he loved his job, and so I have many experiences like that. So when I meet a fisherman, or some repairmen, the cable guys, and the taxi drivers. So yeah, so that I think I have a few the talent of the writers, but the one thing I really like is making people talk to me. So for a long time. So that is my story.
I wonder how many people have lost their jobs as a result. I want to talk just a bit about your short story called 그림자를 판 사나이. The English title is The Man Who Sold His Shadow. It's up on Words Without Borders, the site of translations from around the world. I mentioned the word solitude before, and this is probably one of the loneliest stories I've ever read in my life.
Thank you.
I've read it several times actually, and each time I read it, it quietly, slowly breaks my heart. I'm interested in both the story's origins as well, but more the pattern of images in the story. It starts with a bird and a shadow. There's a man and woman hiding in the bushes, a man and fire. There's others, I won't give the story away, I won't spoil it. But I'm interested in how the images are important to you in shaping your work. I see it again in the book. I'm translating Kim Yong-ha's latest novel. And again, I see that preoccupation with the image and how the image surprises us much later in very unusual ways.
Yes, the story is my favorite short story too. So, and the story started from an image. So, Krys, you so right. So, you know the LP album of Pink Floyd. I forgot the name of the album. What is that?
Dark Side of the Moon?
Dark Side of the Moon? No, a guy is
On fire.
Wish You Were Here.
Oh yeah, wish you were here.
wish you were here.
Yeah.
That's right. So, when I wrote the story, so I just so the album. So the album is my wife's favorite album. So she really loves the Pink Floyd. So so the story started from the image, and so let me tell the background of my childhood. That so I had a Catholic background. So when I was born, so my mother and my father, what is that? 영생, 세례, 영생.
Baptized?
Baptized me. So I have a Catholic name. So my name is Antonio.
No.
So I'm Yongha Antonio Kim. So my aunts and my uncles called me when I was baby, so Antonio. So I thought that was my name. So my family has a very strong, Catholic background. So when I was the high school student, I wanted to be the monk, Franciscan monk. So in summer vacation, so I would visit Franciscan monastery, and I stayed there in 7 days or 10 days with my friends. So some of my friends became the monk or the father, priest, but I was expelled by some monk because too talkative and so one day a monk brought me to his office, and he told me, you are not the kind of people who can stay in the monastery for your life. So yeah, that kind of my experience, you know, include.
I hope someday you went back to or go back to that father and say, "I'm a writer because of you." He chased you out.
I really like the clothes. It's very, very, comfortable. But I don't, want to go back to the monastery. It's too boring.
Right. Yes, we talked briefly about the stories as well as the novels, and I want to go back to something that the writer Chang Rayleigh had once said. The writers are essentially short story writers or novelists at heart. He gave an example of Tobias Wolff, he said was essentially a short story writer, even though he's won prizes for his memoirs and novels. Do you consider yourself more of a story writer or a novelist? What form attracts you most?
Actually, I don't agree with his words. Writer is essentially can be a short story writer or novelist. I don't know much about the American tradition, but in Korea many writers do write short stories and novels simultaneously.
I think he means what do you consider your greatest strength, like at heart? What is the form that's most natural to you?
Yeah. Actually, so my audience, the Korean audience, prefer my short stories. And my short story collections sells more than the novels. It's not common even in Korea, but in my heart, so I want to be a novelist. Not short story writers. So I think writing short stories is looks like a hobby to me. So sometimes I wrote my short stories just one day or 2 days. I write very fast. When I write short stories, so I write it really fast. And I revise it many times, but the first draft is I really work fast. But when I write novels, it's totally different. So I think about many things, the characters and the plots, and I do research, blah blah blah. But when I write short stories, so I don't do research. Just write the fast. So just like the TED Talk, right? So.
It's interesting. It's funny because when I think of myself, I've seen that I feel like I'm much more of a natural novelist, but I really wish I were a real story writer in some ways.
Really?
I started with a story collection, but of course everything exploded over 50 pages, and then I had to throw it all away. So I think there's some kind of natural orientation, but we always want to be what we're not in some ways. I want to go to translation, actually, not of your work per se, but your translation work itself. Kim Yong-ha has actually somewhat recently, 4 years ago, has translated The Great Gatsby into Korean, and it's now #2 on the bestseller list. But the act of translation, of course, is going, especially from Korean to English or English to Korean, transforms a work so much because you're reversing the order of the sentences, essentially, and reconstructing a voice and a tone and a character. And when you look at your translations of your own work, these books here, and you may have looked at parts of it, no matter how good a translator you have, you're going to see your work altered. And in what ways do you think your work has changed in the translation? What are you less satisfied with, or how do you think your work suffers through translation? What gets lost in translation?
so I in 2003, so I heard the two high school boys were talking so in the bookstores. So they were talking about the Great Gatsby, so the Great Gatsby in Korean, the translated version. So the two high school guys were talking. So holy shit! So this novel is so boring. Blah, 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 blah. So I was shocked, and so I checked the translated versions of the Korean versions of Great Gatsby. So I found so the translations were not good enough to the high school students enjoy, and so I didn't think the Great Gatsby is not that boring, and so that is romance. That is the romance story, and yeah, so that's why I so began to translate the Great Gatsby. So in Korean versions, Nick and Daisy at that time, so in the Korean version, so they speak in 존댓말. How can I say in English?
Formal Korean?
Yeah.
High register Korean?
Yeah. Nick and Daisy is cousins, but they speak in the 존댓말 in Korean, and so that kind of things. So there were that kind of things in the translations. So I tried to make the younger version of Great Gatsby. So I did it. So I finished it in 2009, and luckily, the Baz Luhrmann made a film. So now the Great Gatsby was the My Great Gatsby is on the bestseller list. So where I haven't get the length. So I haven't entered into the top 10 of the bestseller list in Korea. But the Great Gatsby, my translation is now the number 2, second or third, and so how lucky I am. But yeah. So and I think the translation have not changed my style. So because the Great Gatsby is my only translation, and the story, the novel is very short.
Actually, I meant when your own books were translated, do you feel as if do you feel like things get lost in your own work when they're translated?
Actually, I don't read my translations. So yeah. People wouldn't believe my word, but because I write in Korean, and I revise it so again and again so many times. So I don't want to read my novel in English or in French but so when I was in New York City and in the United States, sometimes I have to read my novel in English. So as you heard, so I did the practice to read my novel in other languages like English, but that's not common. So I just believe my editor and my translators. That's all I can do. So yes, I choose good. I try to meet a good editor and a good translator and a good literary agent, and so I don't do anything beyond the choice. So yeah.
The last question, I mean, not the last question tonight, sorry. The last question about translation, though. What do you think are some differences between a writer's and a translator, a writer's approach to translation and an academic's? Because both in the States, but particularly in Korea, many academics are actually doing translations of some of the great classics as well as the contemporary literature. And I just read yesterday, the day before yesterday, I had a huge row with a very famous Korean professor who wouldn't allow me to change a word of his translation in a poem that he had both misinterpreted, condensed, and used a very formal diction in a place where it didn't require that. And he said, you can't touch it, not a word. And I wonder what your experience has been when you look at all the works in Korean. They read so much translated literature. I wonder, what do you think of those translations done by writers like Chung Young-moon versus professors and academics?
Difficult question. I have to thought about it. So, 좀 더 짧게 다시 한번 잘 이해하지 못했어요.
Essentially, people who translate, if they come from an academic background versus more a literary background in terms of their own writing, do you see that difference in Korea in the translations that you read? Or do you think that academics are doing very good translations in Korea as well?
죄송합니다. 제가 이 질문을 좀 이해를 못하고
아니, 그냥 넘어가겠습니다. Sir?
죄송한데 제가 너무 궁금했던 질문입니다.
네.
아까는 한국어로
해주세요.
네. 그러니까 요번에 그 개츠비 책도 내시고
네네.
그런 걸 보면 이렇게 작가로서
네.
어떻게 보면 아주 예능감이 있는 작가로서 번역을 하시는 경우잖아요. 그리고 다른 번역가 중에서도 특별히 아주 작가로서의 능력이 있는 분이 스스로 번역하실 수도 있겠고, 아니면 한국에서는 번역하시는 분들에서 학자라든지 아주 프로페셔널하게 그냥 쓰시는 분들이 있는데, 저도 이제 번역 연구를 하는 사람이라서 그게 굉장히 오늘 여쭤보고 싶었어요. 그래가지고 본인이 하실 때 어떤 작가로서의 그게 개츠비 하실 때 들어갔는지, 내지는 다른 분들하고 얼마나 차이가 날 것인지. 그냥 어떤 분들은 사실 그거는 김영하 스타일의 번역이다 이렇게 얘기를 하시고 있는 분이 있거든요. 그러면 저는 그것보다는 오히려 정말 라이터로서 더 섬세하게 그걸 살려내실 수 있지 않을까 이런 생각을 했거든요.
I see.
그리고 특히 학자로서는 좀더 다른 뭐랄까 그 분야를 통해서 번역하시면 좀 다른 이해가 다를 것 같아요.
So I prefer the writer's translation. So I think that the translation of literary works is literary works. So that is not contracts, or that is not some documents. So 이거는 제가 한국말로 해야 될 것 같아요. 좀 어려우니까 크리스 씨가 통역을 해주세요. 잘하십니다, 크리스 씨. 저는 번역이라는 것은 일단 번역이 되면 아까 말씀하신 것처럼 많은 것들이 로스트 되잖아요. 그래서 그것은 만약에 위대한 개츠비라고 하면 그것은 미국 문화지만 번역이 되면 한국 문화가 된다고 생각해요. 그리고 그것은 문학 작품으로 읽혀야 된다고 생각해요.
So, referring back to what I had said about what gets lost in translation, inevitably something is actually lost, and what you have in the original is this American culture, but when it's translated, what you ultimately end up with is something more resembling Korean culture by default.
재미있는 사례가 하나 있는데, 옛날에 빅토르 위고, the French writer, so translated Shakespeare into French, but his translations were very bad. So there were many misunderstanding of the English because Victor Hugo was not good at speaking English. But French people prefer the Victor Hugo's Shakespeare. So they said we need a beautiful French. So that can be a kind of extreme case, but I think that is the fate of translations. So every translation, lost something. Yeah, so that is the fate. We have to accept that most, I think.
As you already know, I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and there's quite a few moments or books in your podcast when you talk about poetry collections and how poets know how to see, the power of observation. And that really, I thought about your work when I listened to this podcast, because I could be wrong, but I do see this growing kind of ability to see things in a different way and to describe them, to make it new for us in the way that maybe your first book didn't reflect as much. And so there's this growth there. And I'm wondering what other lessons or what you've learned from reading, from a life of reading, from other fiction writers and poets. What do you consider the lessons you've taken?
So actually, I was inspired by the New Yorker fiction podcast. So do you hear that? Yeah. That is really good. The podcast by Deborah, the fiction editor of the New Yorker. So I wanted to make a podcast like that. So at that time, in 2009 and 2010, so there was no podcast culture in Korea. So the people say my podcast might be the first podcast in Korea. So. First good podcast, I mean, so in Korea. So before my podcast, so almost every podcast is the missionary podcast by priests and blah blah blah. So yeah, but I got to know making podcast is not easy, So I had to invite the fiction writers to my home or to my office, but it's not easy to. I have to pay something, so okay, let's read by myself. So I just read some of the novels and some of the short stories. So people really like my podcast because my podcast is very sleepy. So people emailed me, "Oh, your podcast helped me to sleep well." Okay, but it can be inception, So when you sleep, you will dream Kim Young-ha, and in your dreams, so you will buy my book in the bookstores or in the sleepy mode. So, kidding. And so I think that reading other fiction writers' the works is really good for me. So I think so these days people read the novels and other the literary works so fast. So but reading 목소리로 읽는다 뭐라 그럴까?
Reading out loud, reciting.
Reading aloud is a very traditional way of reading. In 17th centuries and 16th centuries and the Middle Age and other, so
oral story.
yeah. So reading aloud is a very traditional way of reading and a really good way of reading. So we have to read the novel very slowly, and so whenever I make every episode of the podcast, I have to read my favorite novels again and very slowly. So I found many interesting and intriguing things in their novels and their short stories, which I had not found when I read it first. So I really want to recommend you to read your favorite novels and the short stories aloud again and again. So.
I think the wonderful thing about the podcast as well is not just the orations and the introduction to this great world of literature, but also the privilege of hearing a writer think deeply about these books and aspects of the books. I found it both very inspiring, but also a way of learning as well and thinking about these mouthful of words. Lastly, any future projects that you're willing to share with this group, or or thoughts about how you're changing, or you see yourself changing as a writer and by default as a person?
So my next project?
Whatever you're willing to share.
Yes. Now I'm finishing my the sixth novel, so it will be out in this summer. The very short fiction, so like maybe shorter than this. I have to write this for myself. This is very short novella. So, but this novel, so what I'm working on, is very short, and novel is about the serial killer. So, yeah. So you can expect that I sometimes adopt the very genre things.
Elements of genre.
Elements of genre novels. So as I did in the Yuri is Calling You, or I have to write this for myself, but I adapt the elements of genre novels, but I massaging in other ways. So yeah, I really like this novel. So I fell in love with this my sixth novel. So you can read the novel in this summer. Yeah.
Sounds like it'll be a very busy summer for you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. It will be your turn. Shall we
Take a break.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Okay. We're gonna take.